So this segment is about the rules for calculations for sig figs. So if we have significant figures in a calculation, the question is how many sig figs are in the answer. Now, there's two different kinds of rules, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. We have a multiplying and dividing rule, and then we're going to have an adding and subtracting rule. So let's look at the multiplying and dividing rule first. The multiplying and dividing rule is really the simple one. It's pretty easy. So let's say we have 6.254 grams of mercury, Hg. And I want to know what its volume would be. Well, I'm going to look up the density. So if I find out that the density for mercury is equal to 13.5 grams per milliliter, then I can use that as a conversion factor and put that in here. And of course, I'm going to turn this guy upside down, my conversion factor, because if I put grams on top and milliliters on bottom, my grams will not cancel, and I would have grams times grams per milliliter, and according to the rules of math, we would get grams squared per milliliter, and that is not a volume, so that's not what we want to do. We want to put the 13.5 grams on the bottom, 1 milliliter on the top, and we're good to go. And we're going to calculate and get an answer. The only problem is, how many sig figs do we have? So I'm going to look back at my first quantity. It's a measurement. Somebody measured the number of grams on a balance, and so we're going to look at that and say we have 4 sig figs there. In this number, in the conversion factor, we have 3 sig figs, and the one is kind of infinite. We could say in every milliliter we could put 1.00, but we just know that this density is accurate to 3 significant figures, so we're going to just go with that. We have 4 sig figs and we have 3 sig figs, so in our answer we're allowed to have the lesser of those numbers, 3 sig figs. So that's very useful information, and I'm going to write down what my calculator would give me here. 0.463259259 milliliters. Now, calculators are dumb beasts. They do not know about sig figs. Your brain is much more intelligent than the calculator, so you know about sig figs, and you say, oh, gee, calculator, you have misled me. You've made me think that this is a very significant number, and it's really not as significant as that. We need to cut it off to 3 sig figs. Now, the zero in the front, zeros in front are never significant, so we're going to round to the nearest 3 sig figs, which is 463, 2 rounds down, in milliliters, and that is our answer. So, multiplying and dividing rule. See how many measured sig figs there are in all the measurements in your problem. Go with the lowest for your answer, and that's it. Adding and subtracting is a little different. So let's say we have a couple different people making measurements, and they're weighing things, and we're going to add these things together, and they didn't all measure them as on the same balance, so we are going to have something like this. We have, how many sig figs here? Oh, let's see, that's 4 sig figs, that's 4 sig figs, that's 2 sig figs, but we don't really even care about that information. What we want to know after we add this all up is what 5, 6, 7, 8, okay, 38.579 grams. Now, this is the way your elementary school teacher taught you to add decimals. Is, oh, what do you do about where there's a hole here, this little hole? Well, you just ignore the hole and you go on. But in this case, we can't ignore these little holes where there's no number. What we do is I like to draw like a little squiggly line there and say that is where we cut it off. So we look at the place value, we line up the numbers as if we're adding them like we first learned how to do, and we say, look, this number we know to the 1,000th place. This number we know to the 100th place. This third number we only know to the 10th place. So when we're adding, we can only keep to the 10th place. Where these holes are, this hole, this hole, this hole, we don't know what number would have gone in there if they had been more careful about their measurements. So we now know that we have to cut off the final answer at the 10th place, In this case, that number is going to round up because the following number is a 7, and we have 38.6 grams. Now notice, we ended up with 3 sig figs in our answer, and none of the things we started with were 3 sig figs. So if you use the multiplying dividing rule for adding and subtracting, it will mislead you, and we don't want that at all. So be careful to distinguish between multiplying and dividing and adding and subtracting.